Yes, Mustafa, we're live.
Hello, everyone. Welcome to our live stream with product people. Before we start, I just have one remark, which is we have our QR code here, which you can scan to interact with us during the session. We will be posting some questions. You can also ask us some questions, and you can access it through the QR code or going to slido.com and writing the code written here. And with that, today we will be talking about the myth of API product management. And we have here Deepak Colluru, who is the director of product at GoCardless. But before we start, I can give you a short intro about myself, very brief, and also a very brief one about product people and what we do. So, first, about me, I come from Egypt. I'm also based there. Maybe you already noticed from my background. I have 4 years of experience in product management, data, and cybersecurity. Worked with different B2B and B2C customers like G&D and identity and access management, Mantra Combus, StatsBomb, and Safdesk. I studied mechatronics and I can speak English, German, and Arabic. And now, briefly about product people, how we make money and what we do. We are an interim product management agency. We do product ops and also transformation acceleration. And we try also to give back to the product community. And we do that by doing free events and talks for the community, which has over 50,000 members. And by that, we can slowly kickstart. And we have for you here a short icebreaker, a question which you can answer by going to Slido. And this question will be related to the topic for the live stream, which is, have you or your team used APIs before? And you can give any of the answers below, which are yes, as a consumer of someone else's API, as a publisher of our own APIs, as a consumer and a publisher of an API, or not really, didn't use it, or publish anyone before. So go ahead, you can give us your answers, and shortly I will provide you with the results. So right now I am seeing that 100% used it as a consumer and a publisher. So we have here an audience that really is into the topic. That's good. Let's see if it's changed. Okay, now it's 50-50. Okay. Okay, so it's staying by 50-50. Or yeah, there end result. Publisher of APIs 25% and 50% are consumer and publisher, and the rest didn't really use it. Okay, so we have a good percent of people who used it or published it before. That's a good indication. And with that, I can hand over to Deepak so that he can start his interesting presentation about the topic.
Cool. Thanks, Mustafa. How do I can't see the share button. Huh? Oh, yeah. Sorry. I can see that now. I hope everyone can see my screen. Yeah.
Yes.
Hi, everyone. Thanks for having me. I'm Deepak. I am a director of product at GoCardless. And yeah, if you're wondering why are we sort of talking on such a technical topic, um, probably pretty late in the day, I can assure you this is not a technical talk. This is all about API product management and some of the things that I've learned as I went about building a bunch of APIs for our company, me and my teams essentially. And so yeah, look forward to chatting, and please do flag any questions that you might have in the chat, and we'll try to answer them at the end, right? So on the agenda, I'll do a little bit of introduction. I mean, it's great that a lot of you have already worked with APIs. So I probably don't need, I can skim over that section quite a bit. But essentially, I'll talk a little bit about why we should care about APIs. And I'll try to bust 3 different myths as part of this. Yeah. Firstly, why should you even listen to me? So a little bit of introduction about GoCardless. GoCardless is an API-first account-to-account, bank account payments platform. So essentially what that means is we move money directly from customer's bank account to a merchant's bank account. We obviously take a small cut in the background as transaction fee. And we work mostly in the Western world, covering around 30 countries. UK is our largest market. US, Australia, Europe are all very big markets for us, right? And today we work with 95,000 businesses worldwide, more than 95,000. And the kind of businesses range from like really small merchants to some really large merchants who process millions of payments a day, right? So it's a wide spectrum, and we are an API first company. And one of my first roles at GoCardless was to basically look at the API product and fill the product gaps within our API product. We do have a dashboard, but API is our primary way to get in. So why should you care about APIs? So one of the things when I was preparing for this talk, I thought about quite a bit. And I think one way to motivate a PM is to actually show the worth of the market sizing, right? And I couldn't find any straightforward market sizing opportunity, aspects to say how big the API product market is. But there's one stat which is pretty interesting. To manage the APIs that companies build, you need tools. And that tools itself is worth that particular, all the companies that actually build tools around API product management, they have a revenue of around $3.3 billion. And if you extrapolate that, even if you say companies are paying like 1 to 2% of what they're earning through APIs for tool management, you can imagine how large the particular market is, right? And the second is APIs are ubiquitous. Like anywhere you go, you see APIs. One of the fond examples I always give is the metro lines in London. There's something called TfL, Transport for London. I'm based in London, by the way, and I use the transport network here quite often. They have published their APIs, and if you look at Google Maps, if you look at any of the other maps software that there is, they've integrated with those APIs, and they can give you live information, like juxtaposed with the maps, which is an awesome way, right? And APIs actually allow very innovative solutions that you might not be able to build all by yourself. And a classic example for this is Uber. When Uber started, they were able to go to market quickly because Google Maps API existed at that point in time. So they could leverage it and they can build it very, very quickly. So just having these APIs just allows people to build like pretty innovative solutions on top. Yeah. So the focus of the talk, we are mostly PMs, so there's always there should be a 2x2 in there. And if you look at the 2 dimensions, the public and sort of internal APIs, public APIs like someone else using it, internal APIs just for internal teams. And the second dimension is publisher or your producer of APIs and or a consumer. The focus of the talk is public APIs, right? There are lots of things that we can do in the other side, but I've focused the talk just on this. So let's jump into some of the myths, right? So the classic thing which I always hear from people is API is a technical product, so we should just leave it to the engineers. Yeah, and I've encountered this in lots of different companies, even at GoCardless, to a little extent. What I would say is, well, not really, right? Because if you look at the API lifecycle management, it is pretty complex. So this is something I took off Rapid API, and you can see how they layer in the various things, which is on the publisher side, you need to think about uh, how do you create is there a business need for this? What is the design for this? How do you test and develop this? How do we actually monetize this? There's so many non-technical aspects to an API that I would argue it's actually really important to have a PM closely involved in the development of an API. Yeah. And, you know, again, API is a solution, which means as a PM, you need to have the problem validation and even the solution validation to a great extent, and actually determine API is the right solution. There are instances where API is not the right solution. And a classic sort of heuristic is sort of the frequency and the volume of tasks that need to be done. So if it's a really frequent and really high volume kind of scenario, you might, like anyone might want to automate that. And so an API might be a good choice. If it is a task that needs to be done once in a while, not very frequently, and like not for a large volume, maybe just building a UI is probably fine. So something for you to think about. And what I would say is, we can talk about the different problems and opportunities about how to version APIs and all of that. But what I'd like to pick up, one specific area that I'd like to pick up is a validation of solution, right? Now, if you're building an app, for instance, a mobile phone app, you can just roll out an MVP of the app and then iterate. Based on the metrics, you can decide to cut screens, you can change the interface completely. And yes, some users will need some education, but they'll just learn, right? But in the API world, stakes are pretty high. Why? Because most of the decisions are usually one-way doors, right? And the reason for this is you need, like, once you put out an API into the public world, people will integrate with it. And which means if you change something, that will impact integrations and it'll break integrations for a bunch of your customers, and they will not be very happy with it, right? So essentially, you need to get it mostly right the first time. And sure, that is a problem, but I also look at it as an opportunity. So an API is a solution to a business problem. And so it's essentially just another interface, which means you can start thinking of how do you address them, right? And one of the things to think about is basically you can start thinking about it. Once you realize it is just another interface, you can start performing user testing. Right. And so essentially some ways to do that is, you can start thinking about API documentation basically before single line of code. I hope some of you at least have encountered something called the Amazon's PR FAQ. It's a great way how Amazon builds completely new products. And this is essentially where Amazon tells the PMs that you need to write a press release before you actually go and build a product. And I would actually argue that API documentation, just writing the API documentation upfront, is something similar to Amazon PR FAQ. It lets you put out what the API is, what problem it is solving, and why someone should integrate with it, and what even the solution might look like. It doesn't have to be perfect, but at least you can start sharing it with a lot of different people. Another kind of thing which I usually see is when engineers come up with API designs, they usually test it with internal engineers. And I would argue that is absolutely not the right thing to do, because there's a lot of inherent biases within the company, as in the engineers who might be reviewing it internally, they might not be users of the API, right? So they don't have really skin in the game. And also, they probably just want to be nice to their colleagues, so they might not actually flag tons of issues and all, right? So it's just not the user that you're trying to target there. And then what I'd also say is probably think about having like a customer advisory board. So this is where friendly engineers on your customers, companies, or someone who have already either integrated with your API or actually evaluating your API would be great people for you to give you feedback, right? It's very similar to how you would do user testing with a normal UX. It's just a very different interface, but you can still do a very similar user testing with APIs as well. And that is basically one way to start thinking about how do you mitigate the risk of one-way doors and getting it right the first time you ship an API. The second myth is, well, yeah, you might have heard this many times, build and they'll come. Well, actually, it never happens, right? So in this, actually, you need to think about the different types of API consumers. So I've given a couple of examples of big companies that use our API, and the use is slightly different in how they actually, consume the APIs. So Klarna uses our API directly, whereas an accountant who's using Xero basically experiences GoCardless through the Xero product, right? They're using the same API, but how they experience it is very different. And the level of technical capability are also very different. Secondly, there are obstacles to consuming APIs, right? So this is a report put out by Postman. Postman is one of the tools that you can use to just troubleshoot APIs, just demo APIs and all. So what's interesting here is you can see, like, there's many things in this list that are probably outside of your control, but there's still a few things that are within your control as a PM, right? So for instance, you can create very good API documentation, or how developers actually discover the right API toolkit to use within this framework. And what I'd always advise is actually get a designer who is very tech savvy, and get them to start thinking about users, developers as a user group, and thinking about how to solve problems for them. And the developer docs and all are just one interface, right? Another interface that you can start thinking about. And the next thing to think about is an API PM needs to think about growth all the time. So if you're building an app, a mobile app, or a simple web app, right? A lot of times what happens is you can just build the interface, you can bring in a separate growth team, and then they can just run experiments and keep improving the experience, right? But in the API world, if you're thinking about growth at a later point, once it's released, it's just too late. As an API PM, you need to have growth at the forefront of your mind. And developers are not your only users. You need to influence the business stakeholders as well. And because API essentially is just a solution to a business problem, so you need to be able to articulate the underlying business problem. And yes, this is a solution and an interface, but you should still be able to do it, right? So what I'd say is map out your stakeholders. It's mostly always more than just engineers, right? You need to make sure you're able to explain the API easily to non-technical users. Again, going back to the point of articulate the business problem very clearly. Why is this the right solution for this particular problem, And then finally, I would say have empathy for your counterpart PMs who are consuming these APIs, right? Understand their motivations and build a good working relationship with them. Ask for help them out, and you'll be surprised how much information and feedback you'll get from the consumers of your API, right? Yeah, this is something which is really close to my heart, something which I discovered as I built many APIs within GoCardless. So defaults are your superpowers when it comes to distribution, and use them very wisely, right? So why am I saying this? Because once someone integrates your API, if you are one of the tens of APIs that they're using, it's very hard for them to prioritize you compared to everyone else. Like, it's always a classic prioritization issue. So if you can roll out features in a way that people who have already integrated don't need to make massive changes, that's a massive win in terms of distribution, right? And I'll give you one specific example, right? So we have a product called Success Plus. It's a machine learning based intelligent retry solution. And essentially what it does is, like, we had this initial flag which says retry if possible, and the default was false. And the reason for that is, when the team first initially rolled it out, they were worried that, oh, what will the consequences of setting it to true might be, and what sort of things that we have to work to push that and such, right? And then we did a project to look at some 200 different integrators that use this particular product, and for them, we changed the default to true, right? We obviously did a lot of comms. We tried to tell them this is the impact you'll have, and this is what it'll mean for you. And we managed it pretty well. Only 5 of them turned around and said, turn this off. So by doing a simple default change, we were able to like turn it on for like 195 of our what we call partners. And then it just helped us massively distribute this product. And the last myth I'd like to talk about is you need to be technical to be an API PM. And that's absolutely not the case, right? And I've actually worked with quite a few PMs who come from non-technical background, and they have done extremely well as an API product manager, right? And the reason is, as long as you're a good PM and you're thinking about what is the business problem we are solving, how do we roll out, is this the right solution, do all the validation and such, and then think about how do you roll it out in a way that it is least disruptive, maximizes distribution and such, you're totally fine, right? So what I'd also say is, learn to use a tool like Postman. You should be able to demo your API, but this is not rocket science. You don't need to be an engineer to use something like this. Yeah. So in conclusion, what's interesting is, when you're building APIs, you're operating under additional constraints, right? And I would actually argue a PM is absolutely critical when you're building API products. And that's because of the one-way doors and two-way doors, right? Because you need to get it right almost the first time. Once you roll it out, it's very hard to change, and you have to manage a lot of from an operational perspective. Second, there is the additional burden of thinking about growth. You need to make sure you are nailing this, the growth aspect, explaining the underlying business problem for an API, and then actually delivering that. And then the third conclusion for me is, you don't need to be technical to be a good API PM. Yes, you need to learn a bit more, but absolutely, you don't need to be a technical, like an engineer, right? And that's it from me. I'll stop sharing.
Thank you very much, Deepak, for that interesting presentation. Let me take over the screen. So now you can ask us any questions that Deepak can answer. You can go again to slido.com and click and write this code, or you can just have a photo of this QR code with your camera and go to the link. And while you are posting your questions, I can briefly share with you some more information about product people and what we do. So we cover 3 different use cases, which is interim or fractional product manager. So that happens when there's a permanent position cover, or we do a parental leave cover, or if there's any important or urgent initiative that you would like us to lead. Also, another use case would be program management and product operations. We can help you upskill your product management team, can appraise skills and set up personal development plans for them. And also, we can create and streamline processes and programs. Another use case that we do is transformation acceleration. So we can make a shift from sales or tech led to product led. And also, we can help you configure your product strategy and team structure. So, setting up your product organization for future success. And here's an overview of some of the clients we have worked with. We have worked with B2C clients like Zalando, Tia, Scout24, FreeNow, DeepL, Freeletics, Buck Market, Douglas, Ecosia, Omio, Blinkist, and Emma. And we also worked with B2B clients like Utopia, Pliant, Havi, the World Health Organization, GFK, Cognify, Ometria, Sastrify, Remote, Elucidad, Eterno, and Alira Health. And some other interesting stats about product people. We have supported 300 cross-functional teams. We had plus 70 clients, reaching from Series A startups to publicly listed companies. Right now, we are a team of 42 product leaders and product managers. They are all in-house and full-time, and that is to ensure the quality of our service for our clients. And we have 62% of the team are women, and 66% of them are in leadership. So we have a strong bias to promote within our firm and attract more women to work in the tech industry, because we also work with skills before CVs in our hiring process. And with that, we can already switch to the Q&A. I already saw that there were some questions for you, Deepak, so let's move on to them. And you can still post any questions that you have, and we will make sure to answer them. First question would be, what are some of the most common KPIs that can be used to measure the success of an API product?
Yeah, so very interesting question. Thanks for asking this. So I think I would say, what are the most important KPIs for a product, right? So again, I would say an API product is essentially an interface. So you would still want to track everything you track from a business perspective, right? Are you solving the problem of the customer? So that's like a base set you need to have for an API product, which is essentially what you'd have for a normal product. And on top of that, you might want to add some additional things, right? So things like, is this being used? Like, how well is it being used? What percentage of the user base has actually taken up this particular API and using it actively, right? And just from a usage perspective, right? And then there are some technical aspects as well, which is, how well is this API performing? What is the latency for this, right? You need to start thinking about some of the technical metrics. And again, you don't need to come up with all those metrics. You can work with your engineering counterpart to come up with many of those technical metrics. But I would still say, from a product perspective, you're still trying to drive a business outcome using the API. So you still need to look at those, like, what is the revenue being generated, how many users are actually using leveraging some of this capability. So core product metrics for the business side, then some usage metrics around how well is this API being used and such, and then some of the technical aspects, which is this just causing too much latency? Is it performing well? What is the error rate? Those kind of things, right? And then I would also layer in some of the sort of the more satisfaction related stuff, which is sort of an NPS, but not quite an NPS, but actually talking to your users, getting feedback on how well this API is solving their problem.
All right, thank you, Deepak. So the next question would be, what are some critical artifacts for creating excellent API documentation? Beyond the PR FAQ, your line about documentation before a line of code got me thinking.
Yeah, great question again. And I would say, so let me split this into two parts, right? So one is before the product goes live, and you're just trying to create an artifact that you can actually use a test, that you can share with people and get feedback on, right? For that, I would say just do a PDF. It could be a simple doc, Google Doc. Just create a PDF out of that and just share it with people, right? It could be as simple as that. It doesn't need to be fancy at all. Now, when you're actually releasing public APIs, there are lots of different ways to do it. Different companies do it in different ways. There's Swagger and lots of different tools out there. So I'd say look at some really good API documentation out there. And there's amazing levels of API documentation with different companies. And yeah, I'll put in a nudge for GoCardless as well. And you should check out our APIs. We take a lot of effort to make sure it's easy for people and such. Are we perfect? No, we still have a lot of work to do, but it's a work in progress. It's never going to be perfect, but you can actually look at different ways people have structured their API docs and all, and you can get a lot of inspiration from that.
Cool. Thank you very much. Okay, our next question would be, do you have any tips for making sure that PMs can be included in and understand technical discussions within the development process?
Yeah, good question. I think it depends on how much technical you want to get into, technical detail you want to get into. So I'm a computer science engineer by training, and I've worked as an engineer for many years before switching to product, right? But even then, I don't get quite involved in all the technical details today. I roughly know what is happening, but I don't really get to the code level or the specific tools or the specific things that the engineers are doing, right? I'm quite happy with what my engineering counterpart actually tells me. And I probably ask him a bunch of questions, but that's about it, right? So, but if you are interested, what you can do is basically sit down with the engineers on some sessions where they're talking about some of the technical aspects. So one of the things which we used to have till, I don't know if it still goes on, but we used to have something called code dojos. It's like a very senior engineer would run this session where people they would teach programming languages to non-technical people within the company. And that's an interesting way to start learning some of that, right? And then you always have you have say this product spec. There will be an engineering or scoping engineering spec or like a scoping doc, right? You can start reading a lot of the scoping docs, or when engineers are discussing that, make sure you attend some of that. You may not understand everything, but that's okay. You can actually ask your engineering manager or tech lead or someone separately to say, okay, I got these points, but I didn't really understand this. What does that mean? I think it's just being very proactive and trying to ask as many questions as possible will help you get a lot more technical understanding. And I'd say there's a bunch of newsletters and all, but it's probably an overkill if you're just looking for some of the basics. I think it depends on what level of technical understanding you're trying to gain.
Okay, thank you very much, Deepak. The next question would be, how can we balance between working on product strategy and understanding API with the tech team while working as a PM.
Yeah, so this is an interesting one. So I would still say the main role of a PM is on the product strategy side, right? I think as an API PM, you just get that additional constraints that you have to work with. And you have to make sure that the team is working within those constraints as well. So I would still say you mostly focus on the product strategy, but ensuring that the team has all the right principles in place, like the API management or API design principles in place, so that engineers can just get on with something like that, right? So you don't need to be. I'll still say stay close to it, but it doesn't have to take up most of your time. I'd still say you need to spend most of your time on the product strategy side, right? And again, what I would say is product strategy is, again, breaking down the business problem, what we are trying to achieve, and then API is just a solution and an interface.
Okay, thank you very much, Deepak. We have one last question we got from the chat, which is you mentioned that there's a difference between direct users of API like Klarna and indirect users like accountants. How would these accountants know about your API and how would they care about it?
Yeah, a great question. So I don't think they necessarily care about it. They don't even many times they don't even realize they're using GoCardless. They just think it is Xero, the accounting software, right? The difference comes in because how Xero uses our API and how Klarna uses our API. And Xero, because they're not using our API for themselves, they're using it for their users. So the use cases would be slightly different, and they might require some additional problems to be solved for that specific user group. So you can almost think of them as two different user groups. The jobs to be done between them, there's a massive overlap, right? Most of the jobs that they need to do, from our perspective, it's things like, hey, customer create, payment create, refund the payment or payout or whatever it is, right? Like the core things are exactly the same, but then there's additional information or APIs that someone like Xero would need. Things like, how do you aggregate information across thousands of merchants that are connected through Xero, right? And this is not a problem that Klarna has, whereas Xero has that problem. So it's slightly different use cases. And then you need to start thinking about how do you solve the different problems for the different user groups.
All right. Okay, thank you very much, Deepak. That was really insightful and valuable. With that, we can also inform you that we at Product People are hiring. So if you are interested in a new role, you can scan the QR code on the left. And if you're interested to read more about product management, you can scan the QR code on the right and subscribe to our newsletter. And we will be doing more live streams. So the next one would be with the title "This is Fine: Product Managing Chaos" by Hannah Bradley. So make sure to tune in. And lastly, thanks again, Deepak. Was really amazing having you here.
Thanks for having me.